Greetings. Welcome to a review of Apple numbers and how to get more involved with Apple numbers by a file which can be used every day or as needed because it is in the format of a budget or a finance sheet. The link to the file is at the search bar, also available at the description. Once accessing it, then continue into the file, adding a name to join. Continue knowing it is a collaborative sheet. How to download is the three dots at the upper right, adjacent to the profile icon, and an option to open it in numbers if the program, which might be helpful if the program is already downloaded on your software. At the three dots, the option is to download a copy. It can be numbers format, amongst others. For the review, we know it's already on my software, so the rest of the process of download is not guided. If you need assistance, then you can let me know if you have trouble downloading, and I'll do my best to assist. To safely exit the browser or file from the browser, it may just involve exiting. We will move to the numbers software. A bit about the worksheet or file. The file has 5 worksheets. The first is balance, shortened to BAL. Second is expense, shortened to EXP. Third is receivable, shortened to receive. The fourth is archive, specifically for 2026. So it may be a tab to make more specific in that it is about 2026, and there could be other years in the archive tab, or another year could be in a new archive tab. And the master sheet is fifth. So focusing on the balance sheet, about what is going on here is the highlighted column is aiming to show that the user that there is a zero balance of the money that is able to be useful for expenses versus the money that is allocated for upcoming expenses. And so to the right of the highlighted column is the column that is part of the sum of budget, if applicable, and rest calculation. What the column H is a figure that is based on numbers greater than 0. Idea is that if an expense does not have a budget towards it, then it is not yet considered. So if the expense has a budget of 0, then it does not relay in this column. and that is by using a SUMIFS formula. Looking at the formula bar of the software, the SUMIFS is retrieving the budget figure from the expense tab and the expense table of that tab. So it is only showing the table name based on criteria. And the criteria is that from that expense table, there is a category match of that which is at the same row of the respective sheet we're on. So if the category at the expense table of the expense sheet is also income, then it is retrieving the budget figure of the expense table, and only if that budget figure is greater than 0. Not specified in the formula is that otherwise it would return 0, and it is doing so, so it is not written in the formula. The other part of the sum of budget, if applicable, and rest calculation is receive rest, column F. These are funds which are forecasted or had been forecasted and are in a place for use or available for use, so not in transit. Coming from the receive sheet will be this number based on, again, if it's a match with the respective rows category. So the sum of budget, if applicable, and rest is taking the receive rest income that is coming from F column. It is subtracting the row of column H, the budget, if it's applicable, meaning that if it's greater than 0. And it's an if error statement because it could be more complex. However, it has been simplified to be just as it is, but what it could do is it could have a more robust before the column portion, and then if there's an error in the priority formula, which is receive rest income minus the budget, if applicable, from the expense sheet, then it defaults to an alternative formula. In this case, each formula is the same, however, it is an if error so that it could be more complex if needed. And so this number, based on the amount of funds that are at rest and the budgeted funds, ideally is 0, and that shows balance. The rest of the columns are fairly self-explanatory. However, it will help to move forwards to the next sheet before going into any more detail about the next columns. We've been talking about the expense sheet, and so let's go there. This is where we see the categories, so where we're able to match with the balance sheet based on if a category is of the same. And the 3 columns, which are B, C, and D, are fairly valuable to understand. Gross is the amount, which is face value or what one could see at retail for an expense. For example, what is the listing price of an expense that is on the forecast? I will pass the first two rows because they are more complex formulas that we'll move to in a bit. The third row is simply a number. Or it is actually the fourth row, but the third entry of an expense. The budget is also without a formula, so it can be changed based on the amount that is considered. When the budget is 0, it is not considered in the balance sheet. And the example is that it is $10. Or we have changed it to $10. So now it is in the forecast, or should be, with a debt of 0, which was auto-calculated based on adding budget. To the balance sheet, we can find the medical category at row 6 and see that we have a budget, if applicable, of 10. Back to the expense sheet, if instead it has only been configured to $1, back to the balance sheet, the number has relayed as $1, and the calculation shares that because it is a debt that has been budgeted for with at least more than $0, then there's a debt of $9. If we return back and instead do not yet budget for it, then returning to the balance sheet, we see that it is no longer budgeted, is no longer a debt. And so it does still relay at the 3 columns, which are simply retrieving those numbers from the expense sheet. And that's sort of obvious by the expense leading at the head of each column, showing that it's retrieving from the expense table, if there's a category match, the gross figure. Same for the budget figure, and same for the debt figure, if there's a match of the respective row. So now we know that we have a bit going on at the expense sheet that can be visible from the balance sheet based on change. And let's focus our attention towards moving to understand the receive tab. We've reviewed that there's one figure being relayed from receipt, which is the resting funds. So we can see that there is a little over $6,000 of income coming from rest funds and about $300 coming from a gift category of the rest funds. Moving to the receive tab, you might notice these again, that there are more than one, or there is more than one row, which simulates how the header row looks. And that is that it is with a bold background and a white font versus a transparent background and a dark font. So these have been configured to be simply styled as the header, and that is because they're a bit more stagnant, and it's a custom choice. These can be removed, others can be added if there are, but the idea is that there are account entries that may not move, because each of the receive and expense rows, which are transparent with the black font, are intended to be used at the archive tab, which we will review. So let's test that the amount of receivables is being relayed. And in this example, or in this table, how these are configured is that the gross number is what we are anticipating, or what we know might be on the horizon. Yet, if it's not at rest in the account, then it needs to be in transit, or else it's going to skew that sum of zero that we're looking for. So we remember that there is about 6 or so thousand in income, and that there is about 300 in gifts. Let's adjust from a gift to a personal receivable. And returning to the balance sheet, we can see that instead of the 300 gift, it is now just relaying at the personal. It didn't adjust the sum number because we simply just changed the category. However, we know that it is communicating with this receive rest column. And if it's in your practice to add all of the receive sums, please do so. So we're probably ready to move on to the archive tab, which is a pretty cool tab because it has a bit of communication with the expense sheet. So before we go to archive, let's return to those 2 rows of expense sheet. And before we do that, these are the rows which have been configured with the header format, but they are not. And it is simply because they should be considered, and they are, as cushions or expenses that need to be on the radar but don't yet move, or they don't have a need to move yet. So it's sort of like creating a buffer for the sum, but to make it noticeable, then it has been formatted this way. Now the first 2 rows are what we see in the formulas each. And what we see in the formula bar is that they have first a lump sum that we're considering. For the 3rd row here, which is the personal category, there is a number of 30, and for nutrition, it is 130. And the idea is that it can be, it may be helpful to have an amount that is allocated for a type of expense, such as if I only want to spend, or if I only have to spend $30 for personal expenses each month, then to be able to dynamically update this personal fund based on my spending that I'll add to archive once it's complete, then it can retrieve those expenses from archive based on a criteria such as, and in this case, we're using month, then to let the user know what amount is left from the funds, or what has been allocated of the 30 for the remainder of the month. And let's explore how that works. We know we have an equation or a formula. It is using sum and a filter, and then specifically month as specified. It can also use year, maybe other criteria to filter based on what is going on in archive. And so, again, it is retrieving a gross figure from what will be an archive, or a 2026 archive table based on criteria. And that is if the month of that archive row matches the respective month that we have at our row 3, cell A or column A, and has a category match based on what is G3 of the respective sheet and category of the archive or 2026 archive table. Otherwise, that is the (0) portion of the formula, return 0. So we see we have 2771 left for personal. To the archive tab we go. And that is being relayed by the entry that is at row 6 that occurred in January on the 3rd for $229. It was subtracted from the $30. Say instead that it was $12. Whoa. Still personal, so it's going to be hopefully relayed to the expense sheet, letting us know that we have a little bit less than the 27 that we originally thought. So back to the expense, we see that now we have 18 left. And what else is going on the archive tab? Aside from being able to track past spending, is that it's going to share at the balance of 2026 archive section a visual based on spending trends. And one of the most important parts that we haven't yet covered as we move to the master sheet we'll review is a pop-up menu. And so what we've used to connect the dots between the balance, expense, and receive and archive sheets based on a category is a pop-up menu. And this is formatted as such by visiting the Format tab, sub-tab of Cell, and it is a pop-up menu. We can add and remove entries, and it's suggested to have a master sheet because a list will not dynamically update. And so we see in this that the last entry is education, and let's just look for a keyword of scholarship, not seeing one. This is the list, not formatted much different than another list, yet we can see that if we go to the archive tab, the list that is in use at this one, row 2, by accessing Format and Cell and browsing through the options, does not have scholarship either. So, if I return to the master, and in this example, I have added scholarship to a second pop-up menu. If I copy this pop-up menu, or its category pop-up 1 menu, so I have Command C, copied it to clipboard, back to archive. If I decide to Command V and then check my options, I do see scholarship. Cool. Now, back to master. That's kind of where we're keeping track of our pop-ups. If I decided that I wanted to remove scholarship, exiting Format tab and back to archive, this was the same pop-up menu that I had pasted from that master sheet. It's still an option. Although, if I Command V, it was still in my clipboard. It still has that original option, though that menu no longer exists in the master. So those are not dynamic updates. And I'm Command Z-ing right now, sorry, because I want to redo those. They were, this sheet, I want you to have it as it is and not with much adjustment so that it's understandable to correspond with the review that we're having. So a master sheet may be a helpful way to keep track, but there's still no communication between pop-up menus amongst the sheets. One option is to format each differently, so then when it's in use throughout the sheet, it's noticeable. And that should be the last thing that we cover is at the archives. If a I needed a new row. I've created conditional formatting here, and it's noted in the descriptions when that occurs. But it is to show a cell will be filled, though not if it's a header, column, or row, but based on that it is empty and is visible from the format conditional highlighting section. There's a rule in place. We can get more details about the rule, that it's going to have a red fill if the cell is blank. Thank you for hanging out for a bit, and I really look forward to what you find with numbers, how you can make the process more efficient and a more enjoyable place to be to keep track of finance in a safe way. And if you're interested in more content that is about keeping up to date, then I hope you'll subscribe.